Karen Pemberton stood in her velour tracksuit at 6:47 am, coffee mug trembling in her manicured grip, staring at what could only be described as a neighborhood catastrophe. The Hendersons' pool, her pool, according to the property survey she'd been clutching like a holy relic for the past 3 weeks, was bone dry. Not maintenance empty, not winter preparation empty, desert in Arizona empty. She speed-dialed Officer Rodriguez before her husband Gary had even finished brushing his teeth. "This is an emergency," she declared, her voice reaching that particular pitch that made dogs 3 blocks away whimper. "There's been a deliberate act of water theft in Meadowbrook Estates, and I have documentation proving criminal intent." 20 minutes later, Karen marched across the Hendersons' lawn like a general leading troops into battle, flanked by 2 bewildered police officers who'd clearly drawn the short straw that morning. Behind them trailed Gary, muttering apologies to no one in particular, and Mrs. Chen from next door, who'd emerged with her morning tea to witness what she would later describe to her book club as the most spectacular meltdown since Chernobyl. "There," Karen pointed dramatically at the empty concrete crater, "Exhibit A in what I can only assume is a coordinated effort to undermine legitimate property ownership in this community." Officer Rodriguez, a patient man who dealt with Karen 17 times in the past year, consulted his notepad. "Ma'am, you called about a stolen pool." "Not stolen, drained. Without proper authorization from the Homeowners Association. I'm the compliance chairwoman, and nobody drains a pool in this neighborhood without my written consent." Karen's voice carried across the morning air like an air raid siren. "This is clearly retaliation for my recent citation regarding their unauthorized wind chimes." Tom Henderson emerged from his back door, still in pajamas, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years overnight. His wife Sarah appeared behind him, their 2 young children peeking out from behind her legs like prairie dogs checking for predators. "Karen, what are you doing here?" Tom's voice cracked slightly. "It's not even 7 o'clock. I'm here," Karen announced, pulling out a folder thick enough to stop a bullet, "because this empty pool represents a clear violation of Meadowbrook Estates Community Standards, Section 12, Subsection 4B. All recreational water features must maintain appropriate water levels during active seasons unless prior written approval has been obtained." Sarah stepped forward, her bathrobe clutched tight. "We had to drain it, Karen. Emma fell in yesterday, and we realized the drain cover was loose. The pool company said it was a safety hazard." "Safety hazards?" Karen scoffed. "Are reported to the HOA first, then addressed through proper channels. You don't just drain an entire pool because of one loose screw." She turned to the officers. "I want charges filed for destruction of community property values." Officer Martinez, the younger of the 2, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if this is their pool." "Is it though?" Karen's eyes gleamed with the fervor of someone who'd spent countless hours researching property lines on county websites. "According to my measurements, taken with a professional-grade surveying tool I purchased specifically for situations like this pool extends 2.3 feet onto community common area." She unfolded a hand-drawn diagram that looked like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. "That makes it partially community property, subject to HOA oversight." Tom Henderson's face went through several color changes, settling on a shade of purple that probably wasn't medically advisable. "You measured our backyard?" "I measured the community," Karen corrected, "and I found discrepancies. Major ones." She turned back to the officers, who were exchanging looks that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. "I demand a full investigation into unauthorized property modifications and potential boundary violations." The morning sun climbed higher, and neighbors began emerging from their homes like cautious woodland creatures. Karen noticed the audience and raised her voice accordingly. "This isn't just about one pool, officers. This is about the systematic erosion of community standards that protect all our property values. If we allow unauthorized pool drainage today, what's next? Unauthorized fence painting. Unauthorized mailbox placement." Mrs. Chen sipped her tea and whispered to her husband, "Get the camera, Harold. Karen's having another one of her episodes." "Well?" she demanded. "What did you find?" Dave consulted his notes, then looked at Karen with what might have been sympathy. Mrs. Pemberton, the pool is completely within the Henderson property boundaries. The nearest property line is 6.3 feet away, well within acceptable setback requirements. There's no encroachment of any kind. The silence that followed was broken by someone in the crowd starting to chuckle. Karen's face cycled through several expressions before settling on determined skepticism. "That can't be right," she said. "I measured it myself. Twice." "Ma'am, with all due respect, measuring property boundaries requires specialized equipment and training. A garden hose and satellite photos aren't sufficient for legal determinations." Tom Henderson stepped forward, his relief visible. "So we're clear. The pool is legally on our property." "Completely legal," Dave confirmed. "No violations of any kind." Karen clutched her binder like a life preserver. "But what about the community easement? The drainage rights? The aesthetic impact on neighborhood property values?" "Those would be HOA matters, not boundary disputes," Dave said gently. "And frankly, ma'am, a well-maintained pool typically increases property values, not decreases them." As Dave loaded his truck and drove away, the crowd began to disperse with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed justice served. Karen stood in the Hendersons' driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed case, trying to process how her foolproof plan had gone so spectacularly wrong. Gary appeared at her side, his expression mixing embarrassment with concern. "Honey, maybe it's time to go home." But Karen was already flipping through her binder, her mind racing toward her next move. The survey only addressed boundary lines, she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "It doesn't change the fact that they drained the pool without proper HOA approval. That's still a violation." Sarah Henderson, who'd been quietly observing from her doorway, finally stepped forward. "Karen, enough. We drained our pool to prevent our daughter from drowning. If you want to fine us for prioritizing child safety over your paperwork, go ahead. But this ends now." "This ends," Karen said, her voice rising to carry across the assembled neighbors, "when all community standards are properly respected and followed. Rules exist for a reason, and if we start making exceptions—" "The only exception here," interrupted Mr. Rodriguez from across the street, "is your behavior. Leave them alone, Karen." A murmur of agreement rippled through the remaining crowd. Karen looked around at her neighbors, people she'd served faithfully as HOA compliance chairwoman for 3 years, and saw something in their faces that made her stomach drop. Not anger, which she could fight against. Not fear, which she could overcome with persistence. Disappointment. In her. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for Sunday evening in the community center, but by Saturday afternoon, Karen knew she was walking into hostile territory. The petition to remove her as compliance chairwoman had collected 47 signatures in less than 24 hours, nearly half the development. She'd spent the weekend fortifying her position, printing additional documentation, and preparing what she considered an ironclad defense of her actions. The Henderson pool situation had evolved in her mind from a simple compliance issue into a test case for the entire future of community standards in Meadowbrook Estates. Gary had tried reasoning with her over coffee that morning. "Karen, people are angry. Maybe if you just apologized." Apologized for what? Following the rules? Protecting property values? Ensuring that safety modifications go through proper channels? Karen shuffled through her presentation materials. "If they want to remove me for doing my job correctly, that says more about them than it does about me." The community center filled up 20 minutes before the meeting started. Karen had expected a decent turnout, but seeing the room packed with neighbors she'd served for 3 years, neighbors she'd helped resolve fence disputes and noise complaints and holiday decoration controversies, was more unnerving than she'd anticipated. Board President Margaret Walsh called the meeting to order with the weary air of someone who'd refereed too many neighborhood conflicts. "We're here tonight to discuss the recent events involving the Henderson property and to address concerns about the compliance chairwoman's conduct." Karen stood, her prepared remarks organized in color-coded folders. "If I may, I'd like to address these concerns directly," Every action I took was within my authority as defined by our community charter, and the community has hired a surveyor, Karen corrected. As HOA compliance chairwoman, I have both the authority and the responsibility to investigate potential boundary violations that could affect everyone's property values. From somewhere in the house, Tom's voice called out, "Sarah? Who is it?" "It's Karen," Sarah called back, her voice strangely calm. "She's having our yard surveyed to prove our pool is illegal." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either surrender or total war. Karen chose to interpret it as surrender. "The surveyor will be here at 9 a.m. Friday," she said brightly. "Please make sure all vehicles are moved from the driveway and that any dogs are secured. This is a professional operation, and I want accurate results." As she walked away, Karen felt the satisfaction of a job well done. She'd followed proper procedures, consulted with legal counsel, and was addressing the situation through appropriate channels. The fact that her actions were about to unleash a neighborhood crisis that would make the great mailbox controversy of 2023 look like a minor disagreement was, in Karen's mind, entirely beside the point. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have been perfect for resolving neighborhood disputes amicably. Instead, it brought Dave Morrison from Morrison and Associates Land Surveying, a man who'd been in the business for 23 years and had never encountered a more enthusiastic client than Karen Pemberton. She'd been waiting in her driveway since 7:30 a.m., dressed in what she considered professional attire, a navy blazer over khakis, and the kind of sensible shoes that suggested serious business. Her folder, now expanded to a 3-ring binder, contained printouts of every property-related document she'd found online, including a 1983 environmental impact study that mentioned recreational water features in passing. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Dave approached cautiously, recognizing the look of someone who'd prepared PowerPoint presentations for a simple property survey. "I'm Dave Morrison. I understand you have some boundary questions." "Not questions, concerns," Karen corrected, leading him toward the Henderson property with the determination of a tour guide at a historical battlefield. Serious concerns about potential encroachment that could affect the entire development's legal standing. Dave had dealt with property disputes before, but most involved genuinely ambiguous boundary lines or legitimate concerns about encroachment. As Karen launched into her detailed explanation of pool positioning and community property rights, he began to suspect this situation might be different. By 8:45, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the neighborhood with the speed of really good gossip, and residents emerged with coffee cups and thinly veiled curiosity. Mrs. Chen had positioned herself strategically on her front porch with binoculars, while the Rodriguez family pretended to be doing yard work in their front lawn. Tom and Sarah Henderson stood in their doorway, watching their yard being invaded by a professional surveyor and his equipment like spectators at their own execution. "Ma'am," Dave said carefully, "I should mention that my initial measurements suggest the pool is well within the property boundaries. I'm seeing about 6 feet of clearance from the nearest property line." Karen's smile never wavered, but her grip tightened on her binder. "I've done extensive research on this property, Mr. Morrison. Are you certain your equipment is properly calibrated?" "Yes, ma'am. These instruments are certified and, because I have documentation suggesting otherwise." Karen opened her binder to reveal her hand-drawn property map, complete with measurements she'd taken using a garden hose and her own interpretation of Google Earth satellite photos. "As you can see here, the pool clearly extends into the common area easement." Dave studied her diagram with the patience of a professional who'd learned to handle difficult clients diplomatically. "Mrs. Pemberton, I appreciate your research, but this appears to be based on satellite imagery, which can be distorted by angle and resolution. Professional surveys require physical measurements taken from established property markers." The gathering crowd began to murmur among themselves. Karen could hear fragments of conversations. "Is she really trying to steal their pool? Remember when she tried to ban Halloween decorations? My money's on the surveyor." At 10:30, Dave completed his measurements and began packing his equipment. Karen hovered nearby, clearly expecting vindication in the form of official documentation proving her neighbor's criminal pool placement. By noon, Karen had transformed her dining room into what Gary nervously referred to as headquarters. Maps of the neighborhood covered every surface, each marked with different colored pins representing various infractions she documented over the past 6 months. The empty pool incident had unlocked something in Karen, a level of organizational intensity that made her previous HOA campaigns look like casual hobbies. "I've requested the original property surveys from 1987, she announced to her husband, who was trying to eat a sandwich while surrounded by evidence of his wife's latest crusade. If the Hendersons have been illegally using community land for their pool, every property in this development could be affected." Gary chewed thoughtfully. "Honey, don't you think you might be?" "What I think," Karen interrupted, pulling out her phone, "is that I need to call my sister Linda. She married that real estate attorney, remember? This could be bigger than just a pool violation." While Karen launched into a passionate explanation to her sister about boundary disputes and community property rights, Gary slipped outside for what he told himself was just a quick check of their mailbox. He found Tom Henderson waiting by the fence, looking like a man who hadn't slept. "Gary," Tom said quietly, "you have to talk to her. She's got the whole neighborhood in an uproar. Mrs. Peterson thinks Karen's going to come after her bird bath next. She mentioned something about unauthorized garden decorations this morning," Gary admitted. "But Tom, you know how she gets about the rules. Maybe if you just filed the proper paperwork." "There is no proper paperwork for draining a pool to fix a safety hazard." Tom's voice rose, then he caught himself and looked around nervously. "My 4-year-old daughter could have drowned, Pierre. The drain cover came completely loose. We had to act immediately." Gary nodded sympathetically, but his response was cut short by Karen's voice carrying through their open kitchen window. "Linda, I need you to explain to me exactly what adverse possession means and whether it applies to swimming pools." Tom's face went pale. "She's talking about adverse possession." "I don't even know what that means," Gary said, but his stomach was beginning to churn in a way that suggested it wasn't good news. Back inside, Karen was taking furious notes while her sister spoke. Linda Henderson Kowalski, she kept her maiden name professionally, was indeed a real estate attorney, though her specialty was commercial leasing, not property disputes. Still, she knew enough to recognize when her sister was potentially stepping into legal quicksand. "Karen, listen to me carefully," Linda's voice came through the speakerphone. "You cannot just decide someone's pool is on community property without a professional survey. If you're wrong, you could be looking at harassment charges." "But what if I'm right?" Karen pressed, her pen hovering over her legal pad. "What if they've been using community land for years without permission? Then you'd need to prove it through proper legal channels, which means hiring a licensed surveyor, filing with the county, and probably dealing with lawyers. Real lawyers, not your sister who handles office leases." Karen's eyes lit up in a way that made Gary seriously consider pretending to have a work emergency. "How much does a professional survey cost?" "Karen, no. Do not survey their yard. Do you hear me? Do not survey their yard." But Karen was already Googling property surveyors near me on her phone. "I'm just gathering information, Linda. Knowledge is power." After hanging up, Karen spent the next hour calling surveying companies, explaining her situation in increasingly dramatic terms. By the third call, she transformed the empty pool into a potential property theft situation requiring immediate professional assessment. At 3 p.m., she knocked on the Hendersons' door with an official-looking folder and her most professional smile, the one she usually reserved for dealing with incompetent customer service representatives. Sarah answered, clearly braced for another confrontation. "Karen, we're having the pool company come back tomorrow to fix the drain and refill it. You'll have your precious water levels back by the weekend." "This isn't about water levels anymore," Karen said, consulting her folder. "I've been in contact with legal counsel, and there are serious questions about the placement of this pool relative to community boundaries." She handed Sarah a printed email confirmation. "I've scheduled a professional survey for Friday morning. I wanted to give you proper notice as a courtesy. Sarah stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. You've hired a surveyor? Karen, sit down. The voice belonged to Mrs. Chen, who'd never spoken at an HOA meeting in the 8 years Karen had been attending them. You hired a surveyor to prove your neighbors were criminals. You called the police on a family for fixing a safety hazard. You need to listen now, not talk. A murmur of agreement swept the room. Karen remained standing, clutching her folder, suddenly aware that her carefully prepared defense might not be as warmly received as she'd expected. Tom Henderson stood up from the third row. 3 weeks ago, my daughter almost drowned in our pool because of a loose drain cover. We called a pool company immediately, and they told us the pool had to be drained for safety repairs. We did what any parent would do. We protected our child first and worried about paperwork later. His voice carried clearly through the silent room. The next morning, Karen showed up with police officers, accused us of theft, and spent 3 days trying to prove we were criminals. She hired a surveyor to try to take our pool away from us. She turned a family emergency into a neighborhood crisis. Sarah Henderson rose beside her husband. Our 4-year-old daughter now asks why the mean lady is angry at us. She's afraid to play in our backyard because she thinks she might get in trouble. That's what Karen's proper procedures accomplished. Karen felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she pressed forward. The rules exist to protect everyone. If we make exceptions for emergencies. It wasn't an exception, interrupted Jim Patterson from the back. It was common sense. Something you seem to have lost completely. Margaret Walsh consulted her notes. Karen, in the past year, you've filed 63 compliance complaints against your neighbors. That's more than double the number filed by any previous compliance chairwoman in the history of this HOA. Which shows unthorough and dedicated too. Which shows you've lost perspective. Margaret continued. Compliance chairwoman is supposed to be about helping neighbors resolve issues, not creating them. You've turned this position into some kind of neighborhood police force. Karen looked around the room at faces she'd known for years. The Rodriguezes, whose mailbox placement she challenged. The Pattersons, whose holiday lights had been excessively bright, according to her measurements. Mrs. Chen, whose garden gnomes had violated the natural landscaping aesthetic guidelines. I've followed every rule, she said, her voice smaller now. I've protected our property values. I've maintained community standards. You've made everyone afraid to live in their own homes, said Maria Rodriguez. My kids ask permission before playing in the front yard because they're scared you'll find something wrong with it. The room was quiet now. 47 signatures worth of frustration and exhaustion, filling the space between Karen and her neighbors. Gary sat in the front row, his face a mixture of embarrassment and genuine sadness for his wife. Margaret Walsh cleared her throat. Karen, we're voting tonight on whether to remove you as compliance chairwoman. Before we do, is there anything you'd like to say? Karen stood there, surrounded by 3 years of meticulous documentation and rule enforcement, watching the community she tried so hard to protect prepare to reject her entirely. For the first time since this all began, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd missed something important along the way. But the words that came out weren't the apology everyone was waiting for. If following the rules makes me the villain, she said quietly, then maybe this community gets the kind of neighborhood it deserves. The vote was unanimous, 47-0 to remove Karen Pemberton as compliance chairwoman. As neighbors filed out, chatting about finally being able to relax in their own yards, Karen gathered her folders with mechanical precision. Gary waited patiently beside her, car keys in hand. Outside, they could hear the sound of children playing, something that had been notably absent from Meadowbrook Estates for the better part of a year. Karen clutched her documentation binder and looked back at the community center one last time. She'd lost the battle, but in her mind, the war for proper community standards was far from over. The new compliance chairwoman would undoubtedly be too lenient, too willing to make exceptions, too quick to prioritize feelings over regulations. Someone would need to keep watching, documenting, protecting the community from itself. Karen Pemberton was no longer the official compliance chairwoman of Meadowbrook Estates HOA. But nobody said anything about unofficial oversight.